So, first of all, thank you very much, Wendy. That was amazing, and I very much enjoyed it, right up to and through the closing. So, thank you for closing in that way. I want to make one observation, which maybe you want to comment about, and maybe you don't. But I throw that out there, that this internal passport process, of course, immediately makes me think of the process that is officially present in China, although the system has completely broken down, as I understand it, through the last 30, 40 years. And so a large number of people, maybe roughly the same percentage as our undocumented workers in the US, are in that sense internally and undocumented in China. So I don't know if there's an opportunity for making some grand theorizing or comparisons about that, but it strikes me that you've got the basis to talk about that if you're interested in doing so. And the other question is the question of, well, it's a question that I was asked. So on what basis do you call what was accumulated in this primitive accumulation process capital? Or would you call it capital? You did use the term later in the talk, but that may have been simply incidental. But I'd love to hear your take on that as well. So thanks.
Do we want to take a few?
Yes, but there's nobody else at the moment. Yeah, David, come please.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk. I have a small observation which just came to my mind in the final stage of your talk. The differences and similarities, which I completely agree about, is another difference would be that there is this mobilizational element in what you construct as primitive socialist accumulation. So there is, not everybody, but there is substantial sectors of the population who believe that this is necessary and they want to participate, they get mobilized. So, and that is a major difference. At the same time, we might also say, no, there's lots of similarities to capitalist primitive accumulation. Yesterday, we have heard about expropriated people becoming expropriators at a subsequent stage. But if we extend the notion of primitive accumulation in the history of capitalism, we could also say that the famous masse enlevée, so full-scale mobilization with a nationalist ideology for war, total war, is a mobilizational element in a process of primitive accumulation. And of course also post-war reconstruction, which coming from Austria, German-speaking country, Wiederaufbau, is up until today an important myth in public memory. So we have to sacrifice in order to reconstruct the society after war, and then everybody will benefit. So it might be a difference or a similarity, and I would be interested in your take on that.
Sylvia, please.
Yeah, for me, the important question is, does capitalism need a class of people who privately owns the wealth, etc., etc., or we can have state capitalism, which is based on the accumulation of human labor and extraction of surplus from, the whole class, the peasantry, the workers, however organized. And, some of the themes that were developed by C.L.R. James, his critique of the Soviet Union. And I'd like to know what you think of it.
Shall we have one more, Wendy?
Sure, one more.
The pen.
I want to ask you a question about the function of this for the politics of the left opposition, because there is some sort of a contradiction. I would say that of course, when Preobrazhensky talked about socialist primitive accumulation, the idea was that this state-led process would go hand in hand with the rest of the program of the left opposition, an extension of workers' democracy, reducing of inequality between the bureaucracy and ordinary workers. Now, in the end, in the 1930s, of course, exactly the opposite happens. So the actual process of primitive accumulation that you described goes hand in hand with a ramping inequality and with the complete demolition of any form of workers' democracy. But then I would say, well, the question becomes: we talk about primitive accumulation because we think it's an important notion for people resisting this process, right? We try to talk about the continuing process of primitive accumulation because we think it's an element of resistance today. Did it function that way? Did seeing primitive accumulation in the eye for the left opposition, do you think it armed them, or do you think it disarmed them against the process?
Jacob, I think you want to say something. Yes. Yes. I can read his mind.
You're mobilized.
But I don't want to answer questions that were meant for Wendy. I could.
No, but you can now offer. But you were nodding, and it's on the passport system and things like that.
Well, yes, about the passport system, just a quick clarification. The system, it's often assumed that the Chinese, the hukou system, the household registration system, which is modeled partly on the Soviet system, is no longer in place, that it has been abolished. And the Communist Party of China repeatedly claims, practically every year, they claim to have now again abolished it. What happens is that it has been decentralized, and that local authorities are now free to invite certain parts of the peasant population into the cities, so that, for example, in the larger region governed by the city of Beijing, people who live in the outskirts of Beijing, the rural population of Beijing, can move into Beijing to work there, and there are no restrictions. But if you want to move from Hunan province or Sichuan province to Shenzhen, for example, where many of the industrial jobs are, then you still have to cope with the same restrictions. So what happened is that a system that was meant to tie everybody in place and to completely stop migration is now used to enable migration but disempower the people who migrate. So it has become, it's basically very similar to what happens with migrants in Europe and North America. The labor migrates, but they do not take their personhood and legal rights with them. Personhood and legal rights are tied to the place of registration. You cannot make, as a migrant, any claim to state support or medical insurance or anything outside your jurisdiction. But I'm sorry, I did not.
That's what I wanted to hear as a small little message. And then finally we have...
Thank you for this. And just as I think a follow-up to the question about how do you identify capital in the accumulation, I'm thinking about the ways that we can tease apart, if we need to tease apart, questions of dispossession from accumulation. The dispossession part is obvious, but when you don't, as you said in the distinctions with capitalist primitive accumulation, when you don't see large class differences, where do you see the accumulation? Normally we think of it in terms of the enrichment of one class is where the accumulation by dispossession becomes obvious. So teasing apart expropriation and primitive accumulation and dispossession, are these synonymous in this period, or is it something we need to be thinking about? Thank you.
I think, Wendy, now it's your turn again. Yes.
First of all, a very interesting set of issues raised about control of movements of populations. And I think, this goes back to work that Peter's done, work that Peter and Marcus have done. It goes back to issues in China, and of course to issues today that are probably the most important issues that are occurring with the development of global capitalism. So I think that this is really worth thinking about from over a long period of time, and also on a global scale. It begins in the 16th, 17th century, and then we move all the way through to the present with this. I'm not going to give a disquisition on it, but I think that altogether, we've presented a lot of interesting material about this, and hopefully it can help us to think about the future as well. Let me just say that the socialist countries are not exempt from this issue. So, as a matter of fact, you can see the role it plays in the Soviet Union. And of course, China has now perfected this. It's a massive population with huge population movements, and how the state is controlling population flows, I think, is a really, really interesting question. Was it capital? We had two questions about this. It is a surplus value that is produced by labor, either the labor of women in factories, of peasants, men and women alike, and workers. And it has to do with what they're paid in exchange in terms of what they're producing. And the party is overt about this. Preobrazhensky talks about this. It's not, they understood that they needed to accumulate capital in order to develop the country. So they were not moving backward in time or seeking to reduce production. They had to build an industrial base. And this is the same issue, I think, today that's facing every underdeveloped country, and is certainly facing China. The question is how to go about doing that. And I tried to give a sort of brief sort of overview of what happens in the Soviet case. Capital, even under capitalist accumulation, is not simply plowed back into the development of a wealthy class. We know that. It is plowed into the development and the enlargement of capitalism. So, and we've heard, I think, over the past 2 days about merchant traders going boom and bust, East India traders going boom and bust. So we do have massive class differentiation that takes place under capitalism, much, much less so under socialism. There is no comparison, but it's not under capitalism. It's not simply that, you create wealthy people. The mobilization element that David raised, absolutely critical. You cannot ignore that element at all. 25,000 workers go into the countryside to collectivize. They volunteer. Now they're mobilized, but they're mobilized from below. They are true believers. And they go in with the idea that they are going to help build a better society, and that they're moving forward toward a socialist future. They don't go in with the idea of hating peasants. Many of them actually are from the villages themselves. So this mass mobilization element is enormously important. When women enter the workforce, they do so in many cases with great enthusiasm. There are regendering brigades that are created by women from below that go into every factory and point out all of these jobs that used to be done only by men, well-paid, skilled or semi-skilled jobs, and say, women can do that job and that job and that job. And those jobs then are regendered in many cases as female. And again, on the issue from below, there is enormous resistance from the male working class. It's like this idea that women are now coming in to take jobs that used to be the preserve of men only. There is fury at this. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on from below, and some of it is enthusiastically in favor of the socialist program. Others of it is, shall we say, our male comrades were not always as advanced as they might have been when it came to looking at their paychecks. State capitalism, the issue raised by Sylvia. I don't know what to call this. And what do you know, again, it's possible. There's no question the state plays an enormous role. Is this capitalism? Well, again, we could probably list certain ways in which we don't see a fulfillment of the socialist program, other ways in which we do. So it's a complicated business. And I think that sorting all of that out, I'm not sure exactly what how to do that. But I think just slapping a label on something is not really that helpful. As Don is going to make clear in just a few minutes, this was not Preobrazhensky's program, and I should stress this again for a number of reasons. One, collectivization without agricultural machinery. What the heck is the point of that other than control of the peasantry? The whole idea of collectivizing the household lands was to apply machinery to a system of strip farming and the redistribution of the mere. In other words, was to consolidate land. Here you're consolidating, but people are still continuing to work with the wooden plow. So that wasn't thought of by the left. That was not the idea at all. Second, and this point I think I'll leave to Don to make, neither the left opposition nor the right opposition ever imagined a situation in which we would have this kind of lack of democracy when it would be imposed from above completely, and where it would be forcible. So, I mean, that too, a great divergence. Pepine's question, did primitive accumulation arm or disarm the left opposition? Well, let me say, many people who had been active in the left opposition, including Pyatakov, who became the deputy commissar of heavy industry and was later shot in 1937, were former members of the left opposition who went back into the party and embraced industrialization. It might not have been exactly what they had thought or hoped, but, well, God damn it, it was enough. And it was socialism. It was the world's first socialist state. And, you know, I think people put aside a lot of sort of small qualms, quibbles, issues with the idea that, okay, we'll move through this and then we can move on other issues as well. So the left opposition, large sections of it, go back into the party and actively proponents of industrialization. So, okay, I guess that's about it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a marvelous contribution, and we now have a break for 15 minutes.